I am the Assistant Dean for Experiential Education at UCLA School of Law, and I'm so excited to welcome you back to our Teaching Justice webinar series. Today, the topic is Teaching Justice and Equity through Externships, and we're so proud to present Alexi Freeman from Denver Law.
And I'm Layla Halas. I'm a professor of practice and the co-director of the Immigrant Rights Clinic at Tulane Law School. I, along with Allison Korn, am the chair of the Best Practices Committee of CLEA. And this talk is part of our Teaching Justice webinar series, which, as many of you know, it's a many years long project where we feature innovative faculty talking about new approaches to teaching justice, looking at the intersection of externships, racial justice, looking at criminal justice, immigrant justice, all sorts of intersections. And our next section will take place on April 20th. We're featuring Robin Walker-Sterling from Northwestern, who's going to talk about teaching justice through experiential deaning. So we hope you stay tuned, as always, to our CLEA website, as well as the clinic and Lextern listservs for more updates and information about the program.
And you've likely seen already that this session is being recorded. It will be made available on the CLEA website shortly after we conclude. We're going to circulate that information to you in a link after the session. We encourage interaction using the chat function throughout this presentation. If you'd like, you can even put your name out there, what you teach, if you bring any burning questions to the session today. And if you have a question during the session, feel free to raise it in real time. I'm sure there will also be some space for Q&A either throughout the presentation or at the end. And we ask everyone to please mute their microphones, but if you are comfortable, you're welcome to keep your video on during the session. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alexi. Thanks so much again, and look forward to the presentation.
Awesome, thank you. So thanks to you both for organizing, obviously, today's session and rescheduling this one since I was ill in December, but also just organizing the series overall. I think I probably speak for everyone on this session today, as well as others who have just found these sessions not only to be informative, but also just like meaningful and reminding that our community very much exists. And when we've been separate for so long, finding ways to kind of have that community and be so proud of being part of it, and being part of it with such fierce, smart, amazing people is really grounding and just so important. So thank you both for the effort. So I'm excited to be here today and talk a bit about these issues through the externship lens. And I appreciate you all also for finding ways to elevate externships and people who work in that space. It's a lot. I've been at the law school for, I think, 9 years this summer, which is a lot fewer years than many of the people who I think are even on this Zoom and could teach me a lot. I mean, I just scrolled the face right here, and one of the faces I saw was Jillian. I'm like, well, she probably should teach this rather than me. So, and I'm sure there are many others too. So I appreciate being given this space and know that there are many others that can and should contribute. So to echo the earlier points, certainly if a question, comment, at any point, feel free to raise it. I think the moderators here will help maybe monitor that if that's okay, because I have a little bit of a hard time 2 years in still managing that and also presenting. But also feel free to just unmute yourself and say something if it hasn't been caught. But I do hope that at the end, in addition to questions and comments, and a little bit during, that people can kind of share some of the things that they're doing too, because I know we all can very, very much learn from each other. And that's what's so nice about the externship community. I've benefited from that greatly. And in my 9 years here, I think the community has only gotten stronger and been also better included in the broader clinical community. So it's exciting to see. So with that, I guess I'll get started. I tend to talk fast, which in some ways is great, and in some ways is exhausting. For others. So I will, if I am talking too fast, please just let me know. I sometimes just need a little bit reminder to slow down. I wanted to give a little context to my role at the law school, and as well as to Denver Law's externship program, because I think probably anywhere in the clinical world, and certainly in externships, which is the world I know better, those things matter in terms of what you can do and how you can do it and when you can do it, right? In terms of resources, in terms of support, in terms of visibility. So I always like to caveat that, because I just think that some people who are in the externship world don't have the resources that we do at DU, right? Or don't have the credibility from others, right? Aren't perceived the same way as we are. So, and that can inform your choices. So I just want to put that out there. And hopefully people could come up with creative ways, regardless of the setting and situation and status that they have. So I've been at DU for 9 years. I was hired as an externship faculty member. And within, I think, about 2 years, Ann Vessels chose, many of you know her, chose to leave the leadership role. So I became director, probably a little sooner than I thought. But anyway, it's been a really good experience. And I think our program has grown a lot. At DU, I'm very privileged that I've been able to kind of do some other things besides externships, which doesn't mean that externships aren't worthy enough to do just on their own. But I had been practicing movement lawyering and was just excited to kind of be able to do a little bit of social change lawyering work in classwork as well in the school. So I do that periodically. And then in September 2020, I became the Associate Dean of DEI as well. And part of the reason that I can do that is that we have a team we have 3 faculty members at the law school doing externships. And I think that creates space, right? That creates room to do other things. So again, that's another, I just want to point that out very deliberately. But nevertheless, because of the various hats I wear, I think I have an opportunity to think a little bit about what I'm doing in my classroom, but then also what we're kind of doing about more broadly. So towards the end of this presentation, one of the things that I'm going to talk about a little bit are things that I think we can do actually in the externship world outside of the classroom, but that are still like in the externship space that relate, I think, to justice and equity. So just to sort of flag that. So with that, and I see something in the chat, but I'm assuming you'll let me know, y'all, if there's something I should look at right away. So, and I'm going to keep this, I know I should probably close this little thing, but I'd like to at least see a human being a bit. So I think I'm going to try to keep this and just move it around if it blocks something, which apparently it is. So I'm going to have to move it. All right. So just for context, again, for sort of who we are at DU, just one slide, just to give that context. We're a very, very large program. Probably one of the largest, I think, in the country, though I don't have all of your data. So we work with usually around 375 supervisors per year, and we have close to 600 placements per year. So how that results, for example, this semester, I think we have about 208, 207 students in place in externships. In the summer, it's typically, that is the low end. So it's typically from 210 to 275. And then the fall is somewhere around between 160 and 180. This 200 plus this semester is the highest we've ever had in spring, which is both great and terrifying personally, because at some point it becomes a little bit too much. But I also think it really speaks to our program, but also speaks to just the joy that students are getting out of externships generally across the country. We are a pretty diverse program in that we allow private sector externships. I'm sure some of you are in schools where that's not allowed. Maybe you like that, maybe you don't. Either way, we are a school that has allowed both private firm as well as corporation. So, and generally this percentage is pretty, with give or take a little bit every year, we tend to be around this. And we pull out judicial just because I think a lot of people like to do judicial regardless of their career aspirations. So we just kind of put it out separately. But public obviously consists of nonprofit and government. And then private is the other two, the private firm and corps. So pretty big mix. One thing I didn't mention too is that we do allow paid externships. The majority of paid are in private. It's about 30 to 35% of our placements pay students per semester. These are just hallmark things that I think are useful. And then, as I mentioned already, we have multiple faculty. Right now, the 2 faculty who are with me are actually part-time because that's sort of what they wanted. They are practicing lawyers as well. But that does allow us for sure, right, to have a bit more flexibility and diverse expertise to be able to support, right, students in all of these settings. So that's kind of a little bit of the framework of who we are that I just wanted to make sure that you sort of knew kind of how we operate. I typically, personally, am overseeing the students in public placements and or in mission-motivated private firms, sort of the social justice, civil rights firms. I am not helpful in doing anything with the corporate world, which for me personally is helpful, but also I don't know anything about it, so it works out well. It's nice to have a team. So when in thinking about sort of when I think about justice and equity work and externships, I kind of think about four buckets of how we could do this, regardless of the placement and regardless of the setting, the teacher, et cetera. So first I think about like goal and definition setting. knowing that justice, equity, these terms mean different things to different people, and that knowing that is important, right? And thinking about your why behind those things is really important. I also think a lot about the ideas of like categorizing and identifying both lawyers and lawyering, and why we do this, and what value there is to it, but what we should be doing and thinking about when we are doing such categorization. Because some people would categorize and say, well, if you're doing this, you can't do justice work, or you can't do this work in an equitable way, right? So that's the kind of thing I think it's important to consider, especially when you run a program that does public and private. I also think about the idea of multidisciplinary approaches to justice and equity. I think with the exception of some in-house clinics, a lot of students are, still learning, the law and not necessarily thinking about it as it intersects with other disciplines that absolutely affect justice and equity. So I feel like it's our role, since people are working in practice, to bring in multidisciplinary things, particularly around communications. And I also am always thinking about how can the student apply what we're talking about at their placement, the here and now, of course, but also beyond, right? We should always, and I know this is a principle that we all think about when we think about reflection, but it's really like beyond, not just like what's my next step, but also like these ideas of justice and equity. How do they feel? How do they look in different settings in the profession? How will they look for me when I have different priorities? All those kinds of things. So these are sort of like overall statements that we are kind of key areas that we're kind of thinking about. So I want to go through a few different things that we do, and I've kind of categorized them in different ways. So one is I'm very much into interactive things, and I'm sure many of you are too. We're not lecturing regularly, or at least I'm not. And I think about like, how are I think it's important to have a foundation and think about like how we can assess justice, and what does that look like. So there's a couple of ways that I do this. I'm gonna get into kind of the meat of teaching exercises now. So one is what I call an exercise called What Counts. So many of you all know about loan repayment programs, right? And how students, depending on where they're working, can get assistance from schools, from the government, whatever, right, with their loans. And there's a book, public interest lawyering book, written by Alan Chen and Scott Cummings, that talks about public interest lawyering and strategies and tactics. And they talk about LRAP programs. And they specifically talk about this idea of like, what should count, right? So I use that as a starting point, as a sort of a very opening exercise in a class. And I'm going to see if this will actually take me. I think it will. I think I have to just stop the share. So let me just, not to stop the share, but get out of the screen. Let's see. It looks like it's, oh, excellent. Okay. So as an example, is it going? It's giving me support.google. That's never a good sign. All right, let me just do it this way. Again, it's like my first time. All right, let me go back. I will just do it. It was tinyurl.com, right? I tried to make it easy for myself, and yet I didn't do it. What did I write? What did it say? I'm sorry, all. I appreciate your patience. /LRAP exercise. Okay. All right, there we go. Sorry, that wasn't as smooth. But so I give students a list that I've made up of lawyers who could be doing jobs. You can see, right? And I'm happy to, I think tinyurl.com/LRAP exercise if you want to get it. And I can put it at the end as well. Nevertheless, it's different types of people in all different types of settings, right? There's a national nonprofit doing for Second Amendment work, private law firm representing white nationalist protesters, city attorney representing the sheriff's office in complaints against law enforcement, a solo practitioner representing evangelical Christian groups, a DA who's in a rural district, right, where there's potentially an access to justice issue, doing traffic violations, legislative advocacy nonprofit, et cetera, working for a union, someone working with grassroots organizers doing local resolution. I think you get the idea, right? And you can go to the document and see all the different examples. But it's a wide range, right? It's a wide range, GC council of a school district, all these different things. So, and I say, I'm gonna go back to here. Is it okay? Can people just see it this way? I think it'll be easier because I have a couple other links that I have to go to. So rather than wasting time. So, so I say to the students, okay, if you had the choice, right? Unfortunately, money is not all here, right? We have to make choices. Who would you award money to? And I say, often I either ask them to rank everyone, like out of the 15 things, number 1 to 15. I might say you can only award 4, depending on the mood I'm in, right? I'm changing it different ways, but something like that, right? And there are other times in which I'll say, your committee has decided to award the DA who's in the rural district, right? Or your group is awarding the plaintiff side, a small firm, right? Who's representing workers, whatever it may be. And you've got to argue why you should be awarded the money. And then I also then ask them to think about their own externship placement. If given the work that you're doing, given the work that you see lawyers doing, should they be eligible for LRAP, right? Should they get some support? And we're assuming what I'm talking about here is actually not the money piece, right? I'm sort of like, I don't give them any salary information as to what these people are making. And then we kind of go through and we say, why did you make the choices, right? What are the things? And these tend to be some of the things that come up, right? And actually they're not about money, because money, again, is not a variable. They're like, why I think this person is doing it, even though we have actually no idea, right? What motivated this person, there's no more context. The specific practice setting, the subject matter, and then what they're doing, right? So, and what they're doing is, am I doing legislative advocacy, whether I'm doing litigation, I'm working with organizers, and you will get a huge range, right? A huge range of where people are coming from. And we start to talk about like, what is your background that affected your, like the things that, what you value, right? Why you care. And some people will say, the people who are sort of focused on like, rules and fairness, and they're like, practice setting, this should be public. That's it, right? It should only be public. There are other people who have like sort of this, are really guided by strong values, right? And they're like, the subject matter of supporting, white nationalist protester, I don't care that it's a constitutional issue. Like that person should not be awarded, right? If I had to pick, right? And also perceived motivations of why people are doing those kinds of jobs. Also, what is actually learning, that comes a lot out, right, in the strategies conversation. So it's a really interesting and thoughtful discussion, both about the profession as well about who you are, right? And I think we're always trying to get people on both planes there, right? Like what's working for you, but also what profession are you joining? And we start to think about, why does it actually even matter that we are categorizing people? And of course, there is a logistical reason. So then I then give like the story of like the public service loan forgiveness, like what actually it covers. I talk about what DU's program covers. We give some like matters for tax, right? We do a little bit of the reality, but we also talk about like, we categorize people because we tend, I think, and as a former public interest lawyer, I sort of say, I think sometimes we like want to have these buckets, right? And we want to sort of say who should belong in this bucket and who shouldn't. And I think when we're thinking about equity, that's a really that's hard. I think that's hard to do, because when you look at like data around who's a public interest lawyer, for example, doing sort of work that a lot of people would say is like justice oriented, versus a private firm or corporation, you find more non-people of color, right? And that is often tied to economics. That is often tied to wanting to access traditional modes of power, right? That you have not been able to access for generations. But yet we look at those people sometimes, and I say we as a global we, obviously, with disdain that they're making that choice, right? To use their law degree, but there are so many layers, right? As to why people make these choices. So we have discussions about this. And I think it's just really important to think about whether we ought to be having these categorizations, and instead thinking about more as like, what is sort of your North Star, right? Like what matters for you is what's important, and thinking about the profession is important, but we don't need to kind of have an us versus them mentality in some ways, if we're truly thinking about some equity things. So that's one exercise. Another exercise, and I'm going to just keep it here because I'm going to have an issue, I'm sure, again, is what I would call like our little, here's a town. What do we do? How do we solve this town's challenges? Let's see. These work. Okay, great. Right. So this is a completely made up, however, with like experiences that I think exist. So we say, I give them a scenario. And again, I'll put these things in the chat at the end if you haven't gotten them. But it's basically like, here's a town, right? We give some demographic data. I talk about how it's like, there's been some challenges with the manufacturing industry. We talk about white flight. We talk about how there's an immigration detention facility, how the area is, heavily policed, police in schools, police outside of schools, these kinds of things. There's issues around like loitering, solicitation, as defined by folks who sort of use those terms, right, to say what people are doing. The local jail is full. There's some people working with, don't get much to say around their wages, their conditions. some may be undocumented, et cetera. So you're kind of putting forth, like in any kind of city, like here's a lot of things that happen, right? And we say, then we give information specifically about the power structure, right? And we do some identity, at least around race, and we do some identity around what they have said are their priorities. And giving this information is a way to kind of show that in any town, you're going to have different people who have different perspectives on issues, right? So we go through who are the judges, right? What are their backgrounds? What are they focused on? Who are the different community players, right? Who are the different stakeholders? There's always groups in a community. As a lawyer, always think about that, right? We talk about the sort of formal lawyers in terms of the criminal system. I share the media outlets. So in case some of you are not on, he'll go here. The city council, the superintendent, what are their perspectives, right? Kind of going through. And in the media, we're talking about everything from the local, right, the daily thing to something that's a little bit more local or targeted, depending on population. The various nonprofits. In this school, there's a clinic, there's a law school, right, not too far over, et cetera. And then the question is basically, there's a group that came to you, right? A group of students and college students of color, and they want to do work that affects the city that's clearly having some challenges, right, around justice, around equity. And the questions are like, what are you going to do, right? How would you proceed? How would you make decisions? What challenges would you anticipate? And what if you care really about just like getting a policy change, right? Or getting a legal change, or versus what if you care about actually shifting power, because you have the power mechanisms here, right? So it's a really interesting exercise because students have generally, when they get an assignment, whether it's at their office or whatever, they don't have often the broader context. So first, I'm like, you're right, we've given you a lot of context. Do you have any of that context for the assignment that you are doing at your office? 8 out of 10 are like, no, right? So one, great, let's try to let's coach you how to get context, because one, context helps motivate. Two, context gives you the bigger situation of what's going on. And like, maybe you're gonna wanna get different information, ask different questions and the like. So it does and I think that's just a very helpful strategy and skill to think about, right? So we talk about that. But then we also talk about if you're thinking about justice and equity, you can't just look at the one particular issue that you have been assigned, right? You may ultimately only work on that issue because there's been a decision or an intention that this is the area of focus that the group wants, that this is your capacity, whatever it may be, but you can't operate with in a tunnel that you don't know what the other situations are or how it can affect, because a decision that you make on A is likely going to have some sort of domino effect on all these other things. And a community is dealing with all of these other things all the time. So it's a very interesting conversation because students have often never thought about any of these things. They're like, I have no idea what the news outlets were. Well, this might be something useful, right, to think about. Or they think about it when they're ready to file the litigation, but they don't think about it in all the rewind steps before that. And this kind of gives you all that information in advance. So if you have this information, what should we be doing about it? So it's a really, I think, we could do like a whole class, frankly, and I mean class like a month of classes just on this scenario. But we sort of use it as a prompt to think about justice and equity issues and lawyer issues intersect, right? And if you really want to take a lens in which you are trying to get to create an equitable setting, to create justice as you and the organization, et cetera, define it, you have to think about these other things. Even if you don't end up working on them, you have to sort of consider what is the aftermath, right? What are the effects? What are you leaving the community with, et cetera. Also, I should mention the idea of power building for a lot of people is a new concept, right? So the idea of not just looking at what your legal tools will be able to supply, but whether you're actually leaving the community with not just potential good solution on X issue, but also with more information, more knowledge, more ability to influence, right? And or have control, which I think is part of a power discussion. So again, students are like, well, can a lawyer be involved in it? Yeah, what have you, did you just file everything, or did you actually engage with people? Did you give people information on how they got this information? Did you talk through strategy? All these things. So these are things that we talk about. So another thing that we talk about a lot, keeping up with the interactive exercises, but really focusing on the fact that money, when you think about justice and equity issues, money matters, right? So why does money matter? Some people, and it's not just some people make more money than others, right? Instead, it's money can influence, right, the decisions that you make. And the question becomes, where are your values, right? Like, what are you willing to compromise on and what are you not willing to compromise on? And I think in the world that we live in, compromise is often a part of it, right? To make sort of any kind of progress. So we have an exercise, again, sort of stemming from this book, but deviating a bit as well. You're working at a nonprofit, let's say, right? Where often people are thinking like, yep, this is the pinnacle of justice equity work. I'm at the nonprofit, right? And you want to, for some reason, right, you want to take an outside agitator approach, meaning you don't want to work within the system to make a change, whether it's you want to like have some big media blitz or you want to file a lawsuit, whatever it may be. To get fund, the funder doesn't want you to do that. They want you to work on this issue, but they want you to train strategies, right? So maybe they want you to work, if it's a school thing, work with the school district directly, right? To have some sort of like staff person in the building who works on these issues, for example, versus a city council resolution that would mandate XYZ. I'm kind of making this up, but things like that. So it becomes a question as to like, okay, if you are thinking about justice and equity, right? Like, will this compromise what you, your client, your community, et cetera, have defined as what justice and equity in this particular issue look like for you? If it will, then you need to think about this. You may not want to take this money. And this gets into a bit of a discussion, of course, about mission drift and all the things that happen a lot, I think, with public service and or nonprofit work. And I think become very difficult to sort of figure out where, you know, where is that compromising? Like, where should I could keep going. It could be a slippery slope. Where do I end? So then we take a step back and we say, have you, like, did you ever have that conversation, right? About like what that original definitional foundational framework piece about what justice is for you in this process and what justice is for you in this result. And the same with sort of equity and other DEI related things, et cetera. And oftentimes the idea is like, you didn't, right? So, and then we take it back to the placement and I say, okay, you're working on X. How did the office decide to work on this? Like, what are the factors that the office is considering and why? Who is involved in those decisions? I don't know, right? This would be a good discussion, right? To have with your supervisor. And what I have found oftentimes is that students are actually curious, right? When they start to think about it, but they might be afraid to ask it, or they don't know what to ask. So this kind of gives context, right? It's a seed. And a lot of the things here are seeds to then have students be able to bring to their placements to think about these topics. And often I have found supervisors who say, I so appreciate you asking, like, unless they're busy right at that particular moment, they're okay often to have these conversations beyond just the tasks. And we want to encourage students to think beyond just the tasks. Because also in social justice related work, you got to think beyond just the one thing that you're looking for. So it translates both to like what I'm talking about now, right? And then what I'm hoping to do with my career moving forward. Okay, moving forward. So we also talk about the idea that there are many different ways and strategies to achieve justice and equity, right? That was kind of demonstrated in the LRAP exercise. But I also try to bring in like real life examples. So for example, some of you may have watched Kimberly Motley's TED Talk. This is a picture of her. We're not going to show the TED Talk here. But Kimberly Motley is a lawyer in, I believe, Afghanistan. And these are some quotes from her talk. She says, I work the system from the inside out, and I use the laws in the ways that they're intended to be used. I use existing laws, often unused laws, and I work those to the benefits of my clients. So her sort of philosophy, and students watch this, right, is that like laws are designed to protect, right? Which is different than some people who would say laws are designed to oppress, right? But her philosophy is laws are designed to protect, and I'm going to like pull them, and I'm going to like find the holes and say that people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, and I'm going to like achieve justice in that way. And to be clear, as at least, I don't know her personally, but as demonstrated by her TED Talk, she's done some really important work, right, around human rights issues in Afghanistan. But this is definitely the approach. You contrast that with Vivek, right, where he says, and I'll quote, we tend to focus on formal court channels that are impractical for many of the problems people face. Worse, our profession has shrouded law in a cloak of complexity. Law is like riot gear on a police officer. It's intimidating and impenetrable, and it's hard to tell there's something human underneath. If we're going to make justice a reality for everyone, we need to turn law from an abstraction or a threat into something that every single person can understand, use, and shape. So in contrast, right, so he is like, I don't want a lawyer kind of just coming in as a consultant and like giving their expertise, right? I don't necessarily want to say, here's the laws on the books and like, let's use them, let's tweak them, right? He's saying, I want to use reforms, I want to create reforms aligned with the community, right? I want to create reforms in a way that we're actually maybe not using the master's tools, right? And instead, it's going to allow us to like have a bigger picture on social change issues. I would encourage you all to look at both of these TED Talks, and you can kind of see the contrast, right, in the approach. And again, he's done some really, really important work, right? Internationally, both of them have an international slant, which I think is why it's a good comparison as well. And we don't always talk about that in law school international work. So it's another opportunity, right, to elevate different practice. But like these are two different approaches. So then we talk to students, right? And we say, what about for you, right? Do you think each of these approaches can result in justice and equity, right? Do you think that both of these folks are doing work with, sort of principles of justice, equity in mind? And then we talk about the differences, and we think about what their offices are doing. We think about, and if it's people working in clearly social justice spaces, it's like the PD versus the ACLU. A lot of those people have very similar values, I imagine. They're doing work differently, right? So you can kind of come up with it. It's also you can also think about even prosecutor versus PD, right? I would say some people think the prosecutor is using the laws, right, that exist in ways that are helpful. Obviously, there's great range of thoughts on these, but the point is that it's giving examples outside of their little spaces, which gets them to start thinking about the world beyond their space. I also think sometimes it's a little less personal. And to me, that's a good way to start the conversation. You then bring it back, right, to the placement, but you want them to be able to get their ideas, their values, when they're not kind of comparing what their friend is doing or what they're doing, right? But actually other people who have been doing work. Relatedly, there is what I call, we have access to, and I could send this to anyone who's interested. We have access to what I call kind of like a We Charge Genocide case study. We Charge Genocide was a group in Chicago, and they may actually, I said was, they may still be an active organization. A few years ago, there was a very public situation and conflict between this organizing group, Recharge Genocide, of which Black Lives Matter is also engaged with them, and the ACLU of Illinois. And essentially, without going, we give the students like a packet of information, but essentially, Recharge Genocide was pursuing like a city council ordinance, excuse me, city council ordinance around stop and frisk. And the ACLU was involved in that effort with them. They were all working together, they were talking, et cetera, et cetera. Unbeknownst to Recharge Genocide group, ACLU was also having other conversations with the mayor, with the police around related issues. And long story short, an action is taken by the mayor and the police that the ACLU applauds, and they say this was part of our negotiations and our settlement, and it does not include passing this ordinance that the groups were all involved in and that the community group had been leading. It doesn't necessarily foreclose it from happening in the future, but certainly it deals with related data gathering issues around police and stop and frisk, so that you can imagine that the decision maker, the power player, the mayor, the police, like they're not going to now go do the ordinance, right? Because they're like, well, we just did all this, like, why would we go shift there? So what's really interesting about it is, one, you're looking at the differences of what the different strategies were. But then what happens is that, and this is I apologize, the materials I have are like not the greatest, so this is the way they look. But in We Charge Genocide decides not to like let this go quietly, and they write a public statement, and this is just like a piece of it, right? Because I think this is an important one, like writing in complete dismay, utter disgust, right? Upon learning the very day we were filing this act, right, you were doing this settlement. And they talk about being secret negotiations. They go on and we say, right, now that this is happening, right, we won't get the data, right? Instead, some consultants get the data. So they point out the differences. And they use I put this on here because they use some pretty charged language, right? And they're very, very angry. And because they feel like they were completely put out, right, of this process. And of note, this is not lawyers, right? The lawyers had like the lawyer conversation, and then the organizers and the community were left out. So we talk about this as an approach too, right? Like, what if you're a lawyer, right? What is the shorter, and I don't think anything here was short term, but nevertheless, the shorter term goal, right, of working in this settlement situation with the police versus also maybe the longer term goal of getting this ordinance, but also the goal around relationships, right? And and the idea of like who we're promoting, who gets the space, whose ideas are achievable, et cetera. And I would say most of the students read this and they're like, I cannot believe that the lawyers at the ACLU did this. And I'm of course just giving you little stints. And we always say we don't have the full context, of course, but the fact that this played out publicly is a really great tool to be able to talk about. You can be doing work at a social justice organization and still do work in an inequitable and unjust way. And I think this is a really good example of this. And to me, it also feeds us into these stereotypes of like sometimes what happens with elitism of social justice or public interest lawyers that I don't think we have to have any part of, right? Because lawyers are still part of a power structure that communities are not, right? And this is an example of how that has played out, right? And how it harmed the goals of a community group. So it's a really, really good example of also lawyers in maybe not as great practice. We then sort of like using these examples, we start thinking about to students, well, what is your actual theory of change, right? How do you think like justice work should actually happen, right? And we ask students to write answers, right? Like some students don't even know what this means, right? So first it's like, okay, a theory of change is like how you think change can happen, right? What strategies you should employ, right? What you think is going to be prioritized for you. So they go through and they answer these questions, like, and we have them pick an issue to be able to make it like a little bit more grounded, right? Pick your issue, whatever it is. And usually it's connected to their placement in some way. And we ask them to be, a little bit specific if they can, but if they can't, broad environmental justice idea is fine. And then it's like, what do you want to do? And like, be specific. What change do you want to create? What are your challenges, right? And then how do you think you should achieve this change? And it's the rare student, right? And what's your role, right, in doing that, right? And then what else do you need to know, right? So what information, knowledge, skills do you need to have in order to be able to see this change come to fruition? And it's the rare student who actually leaves feeling confident that they like are ready to do the work that they want, right? So it allows us to then say, great, let's create a plan for you. What else do you need? What else do you get exposed to at this current placement? And what's the next step, right? So again, part of the reflection and goal setting. But then it's also like, well, let's think about the law as a profession and think about what different types of placements offer you and think about what actually aligns with your theory of change. Some students are so focused on just like getting a placement that they have forgotten like what values they have that guide them and how they think the world sort of should exist and why. So this kind of lets them take a step back. And after they've seen examples, right, of other lawyers doing work, they then start to think, yeah, Vivek, he has a theory of change, right? Kimberly Motley, she has a theory of change. Like, what is mine, right? And I talk about this as being an evolving, lifelong document, right? Like it can change and it should, but it's important for you to write this down so that then you can ultimately think about for every placement, for every clinic you're doing, am I gaining new skills that allow me to pursue my theory of change? And is any of this challenging that, right? So those are some examples. I'm kind of just forging ahead and assuming there's no questions or comments. So I'm just going to keep on going. So another thing that is really critical to my teaching around justice and equity are this idea of around, as I mentioned earlier, trying to bring in multidisciplinary approaches and trying to really elevate strategic communications. It's my belief that anything around justice and equity work is like really a lot about also like how you communicate, who you communicate to, what we're reading, et cetera, like outside of the courtroom, all the things, right, outside of the legislature. I just don't think you can think about justice and equity without thinking about like just day-to-day communication and intentional systemic communication as well, right? So I go through and I introduce them to the organization Race Forward. I don't know if folks know Race Forward, but it's a really, the name Race Forward is new of the last few years. They had a different name before. Rinku Sen used to lead this organization, and that might break context for people. But long story short, most students have never heard of Race Forward and or read anything by Race Forward. But they do a lot of reports in which they're thinking about communications and race. Race is sort of the center of what they do. So by no means do I talk to students that justice and equity work only means race-centered, right? But it's a good example to start with, and then you could think about how to apply it to different settings. So I give them this, I give them a report in which they are looking at Applied Research Center. That's the former name of Race Forward, excuse me. So they're looking at like the research on media, and they're looking at research on popular culture, sort of more than the law, and how issues have played out in media and popular culture, but issues that they're probably working on, right? Immigration, criminal defense, whatever. And we start to think about what are we noticing, right? When we talk about what is Race Forward studying, what are they finding? Because do we find this stuff in the law too? Do we need to think about this stuff when we're working in placements? And the answer is yes. So they define, for example, they look at like, when they're looking at news medias or other pieces, they're saying there's often a systems lens, and it's either systemically aware or systemically absent. And they kind of explain, right? Like, how are you going to determine, right, whether something is systemically aware or systemically absent? And you're going to ask these questions. What are the institutional policies and practices? What are the historical underpinnings and the cumulative inequities? What are the cultural norms? What's causing these tensions, et cetera? And you'll find, and their studies show that, like, unfortunately, a lot of what we read is systemically absent, right? This is probably not a surprise, but a lot of it, unless you're reading like, The Root or Vox, a lot of it is systemically absent. So I have students find articles, Google, random, right, that are related to your issue, whether it's the Denver Post, because we're local, or anything, like Google your issue, and then you do an analysis, right? Is this article on this issue systemically aware or systemically absent? And tell me why, like specifically, what are they doing or not doing? So one of the things, they need to know, like, so they're looking for answers to these questions, like, are they addressing these things? But we also talk about to see if they're doing anything problematic, which affects how they might come to this conclusion. So Race Forward also offers a discussion around 7 harmful discourses. So they say a lot of what we do, and a lot of how people talk about issues around race, or frankly, any other identity issue, use these problematic discourses. So the students read about these and we talk about them, right? So the idea of individualizing things, right? Making it about personal people versus systems. The idea of drawing parallels, right? This falsely equating acts, drawing a parallel between like one act of racial bias in a privileged white, situation versus the systemic issues that have plagued communities of color. We talk about coded language, right? It talks about finding ways to divert from race. So blame it on everything but race, or blame it on everything but whatever identity. No history, right? No discussion of actually kind of how we've gotten to these places. Intent, we didn't mean this, right? So it's okay despite the impact. And government trying to regulate the stuff being problematic. To be clear, the article goes into far more thoughtful depth, right, than I am with these discourses. But the students have this knowledge, and then they go do their research, right, on and find some articles. And they find, unfortunately, a lot of these 7, it's the rare one, right, that they don't find a lot of these 7 discourses. And they have to, again, identify it with specificity. And then I asked them to see if there's anything their office has published, right, as a second layer. Even if I also even say if they've published a complaint, if there was testimony, whatever, like it doesn't have to only be media. Can you identify these things? And sometimes they end up saying, for some of the placements, it's a little harder to find something, but for some of them, they're like, oh my God, like we're writing in a way that's totally like doing a lot of this stuff. And I don't think we mean to, because the thing is that like, even like good people, right, who are trying not to do this, we've all been acculturated, right, in this way. And it's what we read all the time. So without real knowledge of what these practices are and real intentionality to curb them, we might actually be perpetuating them. So again, it goes to both like your particular placement, how are we talking about justice equity issues? And then how are we seeing this portrayed more broadly? And I think it also gets us to the broader idea of like, again, not working in a tunnel, right? Thinking about if I'm going to be doing an immigration, I better know what the culture and tone and framework with specificity is around immigration in popular culture, right? By peer organizations, by the opposition. We tend to just look at the opposition and what their language is. This is not all being happening only by like the ALEC, right? It's also being written by other sort of mainstream papers. So this is like a part of the exploration around justice and equity. What's time is it? Okay, 12:17. So I want to just do a couple more things and then want to make sure people have time for questions. I told you I talk fast, but yet it doesn't seem to matter. So, okay, one other thing that we did around a very similar strategic communications idea was, when George Floyd happened, a lot of prosecutors put out statements, maybe not a lot, but at least in Colorado, there were some. And we're not going to go through these, but we look at 2 of them and we compare them, right? And both of these, there's usually about 3 or 4 that I pick. And for example, a couple of them are from progressive prosecutors, but yet they look very, very different, right? And so we talk about the 7 harmful discourses. We talk about why this might matter. And students, there's no idea of who writes which, and it's and students are shocked and appalled, frankly, about like some of the language. And I think this is an important issue because this is a time in which supposedly everyone was going to be woke, right? And everyone was going to start thinking about these things. But yet lawyers still like reverted, right, to dominant narrative and reverted to unjust and inequitable ways of talking about things. And then we think about, well, what would you have said, right, if you were in this position of power? And actually ask students like to write a few sentences down, right? And I think once they see how they react to these, it makes them sort of think about that this is important. And what I would say is like, it's harder than I think to write something down. I'm gonna skip this. I do a lot of justice equity stuff in the news. Law students are busy. I think there are some students reading news, sometimes they're not. And I think it's always really important to like always examine when justice and equity issues come up. And of course, they're integrated into every issue we look at. So I raise every class at least 1 to 3 issues that I think are in this framework, whether they're talking about like a private corporation doing something, whether it's a coalition that's done something, whatever it is. My main sources are these 3, which is why I wrote them down, as to like, what can we think about as it relates to justice and equity for real life that doesn't necessarily connect to their placement, but has them thinking about these things playing out. And oftentimes we can attach it to something that relates to their placement or relates to a current issue that we're dealing with locally. But I think it's important to make sure people think that justice equity work is not only historic, and it's not only like in this like limited bucket that you are working. So sometimes it'll be some very random thing that we're talking about, but it also helps us think of going back to like the categorization. Justice equity stuff should matter for everyone at every time in every profession, right? In every sector. So I'm very intentional about not only picking the like ACLU example, right? And what the lessons might be from that. I just want to very quickly mention some of the department things that we have done that I think are important because they signal to students what we care, that we think these things are important. And I think regardless of what placement you're in, we have a role in doing that because we're so connected to the practice of law as externship leaders. We initiated a public interest in practice series. The career office, all those folks, they do great work bringing in career panels. We need that at the law school, and there are experts to do that, right? What I think is important is to think about strategy, right? To think about decisions, to think about coalitions. So we started a series out of the externship office because we also know that, we do private externships, we do paid. I don't want anyone not thinking about public interest at any time. So we have to be intentional. So we do series, right? About like, but it's not just like, how do I become a housing lawyer? Instead, it's this eviction bill was passed in Denver. How did that happen, right? How did we get there? So it's lawyers and or non-lawyers, depending, talking about like their work. These discussions have been, I have learned from them, and they have been like so many layers like deeper, right? Than just the career discussion. And again, it gets students, and we always ask specifically questions around like how they center or don't center equity, what challenges they see around these things. And they've been really interesting. And I actually think it's important that our office puts this forward because it says something about our values, right? In this work, regardless of where you're working. Similarly, we've done a self-advocacy series. To me, justice equity work is also like, who are you? How do you work? How do you feel, right? About in your office. So we've been doing particular series. This is externship office with the CDO, our career office, and the DEI office. And we are like talking about like what some of these students have never worked or they've never worked in this type of setting. And we want them to know like what are the different things that come up, right? What are often common practices, but what are their rights? So we do this. And these have been also incredibly well received. Finally, again, as an organization that does private externships that allows pay, knowing that pay happens more commonly in the private sector, when we allowed private paid externships in 2016, we very much used that change, which our law school was very supportive of, to say we also need to up our summer stipend fund for unpaid public. So we, rather than having 3 to 4 students who got $3,000 and it was all student funded, we now give 40 to 50 students about $2,500 and it's law school funded, right? And it's like, there is just no way, like I'm running a program that a student can get paid that we're not given anything. And that's, by the way, I'm hoping to grow it, right? But it's very important. And again, I think it signals that the law school does value this work. Relatedly, we have found funds creatively to give parking stipends to students, not just students doing public sector, but this is fall and spring, students who have to go downtown, right? They don't get a lot. We're talking about $100, $150 in the semester. You would have thought that we've been giving these students like a $20,000 scholarship. They are so grateful, right? That we are helping them pay for their parking, right? We're not giving every student, right? But actually, no, I think we've given every student who's been unpaid this fall or spring who actually applied. Some just don't apply, whatever, but we've been able to give them something. So to me, this is important because I want our office to be perceived and to have evidence to show that like, we recognize you have to make decisions, right? That are for whatever your circumstances, And if we're going to promote justice and equity in our classrooms, we have to also promote justice and equity work as a department. So these are some examples that we've tried to do that, both sort of big picture with like something that everyone can use, and then like individual stipends as needed.
Alexi, there was a question about what the creative method was to get the parking stipends that you mentioned.
Oh, yeah. So basically it was kind of talking to various different departments. Like, a lot of little departments, they all have little budgets, right? And I'm finding especially that some people don't know how to use their budgets. I say that in like, the faculty director of X program, like besides running their panel and doing a lunch event, what are they spending their money on, right? And yet they have a budget, even if it's a $5,000 budget, they can give us some money, right? So we pooled a lot of resources from different organizations. We also bought it in a term of, it sounds kind of silly, but we bought gift cards. That's how we did it, because it was just sort of easier. And we got approval, obviously, from the provost, et cetera, for that. We put like the externship program and like labels, like this is a parking stipend. We're not just like giving you like money to go do as you see fit, which I think also sort of was important for messaging. But basically we asked, right? And we said, here's the issue. Every year, students will say in their evaluation, the only complaint I have is that parking in Denver is a nightmare, right? And it is. It's really expensive, right? My office doesn't apply it. Like, and we have people who want to go work with judges. Every faculty member can get around the idea of a student wanting to work for a judge. Great. Those judges don't pay. Those judges are in the like heart of expensive parking. So it was literally just going to different departments and pooling some funds to be able to get and have a basic application. We did not ask students for, I don't want students to like deep financial information. That's for the financial department to deal with, right? But it's like, yes, I'm unpaid. Here's how much my parking costs. And like, I'm going to document that, right, for evidence. And like, that's what it was, right? So it was not a like, we're weighing you more than someone else. And I think it was also important to not have it only public in this circumstance, because you have some folks who work in very small firms or a solo practitioner, and like they actually don't as much have the money to pay, right? So we did want to make this option, which is different than the summer stipends, available to anyone.
We also had a couple of folks who wanted to get more information on the self-advocacy series that you do for law students. And then there was additionally one note of someone who said they've been unsuccessful getting the kind of parking because the school kind of essentially is like, students would already be buying something for a course, and so therefore externships are cheaper, so they don't need transportation stipends. And so curious if you have a response for that in addition to the other question.
Yeah, so for the self-advocacy, I'm happy. One, here's my information if someone wants to just email me and I can give some information directly to you. Or I don't know how you all distribute follow-up or whatever. I can distribute the slideshow too. So we can talk about that as to how to get information out. I'm happy to share. And I do think, again, the self-advocacy, the series being a collaboration, we brought our Title IX folks in as well. The career office took the lead on the financial negotiations. So I think there was that collaboration was really, really valuable. I'm sorry, the other question, around the transportation. So, it's interesting. I find that response a bit obnoxious, but I understand maybe where it's coming from. One of the things I always say, and maybe every school can't say this, but, if we have the law school is making a good amount of money from the number of students who come here to do the experiential learning. Our in-house clinics are fantastic. Our externship program is robust. So I'm like, if we have 200 something students per semester doing this, yes, they're paying for the credit, the same cost as every other credit, but it's actually not the same cost. It takes more time, right? They're going back and forth. And like, we don't sell it we sell it specifically being a different experience. We also want students to be able to really immerse themselves in the placement, go to the networking event, right? Like go to the mini golf, whatever it may be. Some of those things cost money, right? So, but we want to encourage it. So I'm not going to pay for them to like have a happy hour, right? But what I can pay is, and by the way, $100, $150 stipend over a semester is not paying for their parking, right? It's like a gesture, right? It gives them something to help them. But I think that like it has created also some goodwill, which I think is actually important, because some of you may experience like law students don't always want to do externship related stuff. They want to do the field work. They don't necessarily want to do anything for you as faculty member initially, right? So to me, part of the things that we want to think about is, and this is not necessarily only in a justice equity conversation, it's more of like, I want students to be excited to work with us. I want them to know that we care about them as individuals and that we recognize the challenges that they make, that they're taking. Also, gas is like $4 a gallon right now. Like it's not the same, right? They're going to the law school, they're paying it once. Now they got to go back and forth, right? So I think we just sort of, I would kind of just sort of push back against it. It's not actually the same situation as to what they're dealing with. And we want to encourage students to take these opportunities because, these opportunities translate into skill development, into confidence, and into like direct jobs. So if it makes it easier for them to be able to do an externship because we've tossed them a small bone around stipends, I think that's worth doing. I don't know. You can tell I don't like that comment. So that's not your fault, but I just think that that's a ridiculous comment to me. No offense to that. No need to go tell the dean that Lexi Freeman from Denver thinks you made a ridiculous comment, but I don't like that. Other things in the chat here?
Just a lot of gratitude and praise for your presentation, Lexi. I mean, I think that, across the board, we've all felt so motivated and galvanized by your presentation, and just really appreciate all the depth and the thoughtfulness through which you approach, externships and also teaching justice from such a multidimensional perspective, right? You have really, indicated and illustrated the ways in which we can think about teaching, and we can think about placements, and we can think about experiential learning from all of these different perspectives. And so gratifying to hear from you. So thank you so much, and thanks to everybody for joining us again on this Friday morning, afternoon. Really appreciate and value this group's knowledge and wisdom and coming together as we do. Look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks for Robin Walker Sterling's presentation on experiential deaning. We will be circulating that information shortly, and best wishes to everybody for a great weekend, and hope to have a smooth semester as we ride this out. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much. Appreciate it. And Robin's awesome, so go see Robin. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lexi.
Thank you.